They left the house just after 10:40 p.m., when the heat of the day had finally fallen away and the desert outside had cooled into that familiar, uneasy silence. Amelia was the one who grabbed the keys first. She didn't say anything when she did it, she didn't have to. Her younger sister, Riley, was already slipping on her sandals, still wiping tears from her face. The argument with their stepfather had escalated too fast, too sharp, the kind that left a heaviness in the walls. Their mother tried to intervene, but by then the words had already gone too far. The sisters simply needed to get out, breathe, drive around the empty outskirts the way they always did when things got tense. Neighbors later recalled hearing the car door slam. No one thought much of it. Teenagers fighting with parents wasn't unusual in their quiet town, especially in a house that had already survived its share of emotional storms. Still, there was something about the way the sedan pulled out a little too fast, headlights jerking as it hit the dip in the driveway, that stayed with the neighbor who witnessed it from her porch. The sisters headed north, past shuttered storefronts and the dim glow of the only all-night diner for 50 miles. Highway 72 was an empty, unforgiving stretch of road. No one liked traveling after dark. The girls had grown up hearing stories about it: vehicles abandoned in the night, dust storms swallowing entire cars, a cartel-related shooting that locals still whispered about. But they also knew every curve of that road, every fading mile marker, and driving it had always been their shared escape. At 10:58 p.m., a gas station camera caught them pulling in. The footage would later become one of the most agonizing pieces of evidence. Amelia looked exhausted, hands tight on the wheel, trying hard to appear composed. Riley hovered close to her, fidgeting, glancing over her shoulder, even though no one else was around. They barely walked inside, just grabbed 2 bottles of water and stood near the counter, whispering to each other in short, clipped breaths. The clerk later said they looked spooked, but couldn't explain why. No one followed them in. No one spoke to them. They fueled up, got back in the car, and drove off into the dark. That was the last confirmed moment anyone saw them alive. Within another 20 minutes, their phones began losing connection. The towers along Highway 72 were notorious for dead zones, but usually there were at least intermittent pings moving signals showing progress. The sisters' phones, however, went quiet all at once, as if they had entered a valley of complete silence. Investigators would later confirm that their digital trail didn't fade. It stopped abruptly, without transition, as though something had forced both devices offline at the exact same moment. Around 11:40 p.m., a long-haul trucker passing through radio dispatch about hazard lights, blinking way out in the dunes. He said it looked like a light-colored vehicle, partially sunk or angled strangely, but from the highway, he couldn't make out much. He didn't stop. He was already several hours behind schedule, and the road was known for staged breakdowns used in highway robberies. Still, something about it bothered him enough to report it. He didn't mention seeing anyone around the vehicle. No movement, no flashlights, no silhouettes, just those amber lights pulsing weakly in the distance. What happened between that moment and sunrise remained the haunting gap no one could ever fully explain. When the sisters didn't return home by morning, their mother initially assumed they had stayed with a friend to cool off. Arguments in the house tended to resolve that way. Someone left, someone returned, the tension eased. But by 8 a.m., when repeated calls went straight to voicemail, dread settled in. By 9:15, she was knocking on their friends' doors. At 9:48, she finally called the sheriff's office. Deputies were dispatched at 10:12. They checked the gas station first, confirmed the girls had been there, then followed Highway 72 outward, scanning for tire marks, debris, any sign of a vehicle leaving the road. The desert was still thick with morning haze, the kind that rises off warm sand and distorts everything in the distance. But about 12 miles past town, they noticed something unusual: a faint trail leading off-road toward a shallow, dry wash. What they found there never aligned neatly with any single explanation. The drag marks were the first thing that stood out. Deep, uneven grooves in the sand, as though a vehicle had swerved violently or been forced off the road against its traction. The pattern didn't match a simple skid. The marks looked interrupted, broken up, indicating some kind of sideways pull or external force. Closer to the wash, deputies found a handful of personal items scattered in a loose arc. a phone case with a cracked corner, a hair tie Amelia always wore around her wrist, Riley's chapstick, its cap off and half filled with sand. All of it looked as though it had been dropped in a hurry. A footprint appeared near the edge of the wash, small, likely belonging to one of the sisters, but another print beside it looked heavier, deeper, and didn't match either girl's shoes. Before forensic teams could document the area thoroughly, morning winds picked up, erasing sections of the perimeter within minutes. Deputies radioed for backup, convinced the situation had escalated beyond a simple runaway case. They split up, scanning the area, calling out the girls' names, stopping to listen for any sound, a cry, a cough, anything. But the desert gave nothing back, not even an echo. Farther down the wash, they noticed faint impressions suggesting the girls might have moved along the bank before the trail abruptly vanished. It was possible they had climbed out. It was also possible something or someone had forced them deeper into the dunes. The area was too disturbed to tell. There were no signs of a crash, no broken glass, no deployed airbags. Just the unsettling evidence of human movement suddenly disappearing. By noon, the temperature had soared above 95 degrees. K-9 teams struggled to maintain a scent trail on the shifting sand. Deputies found no trace of the sedan, no tire impressions beyond the initial drag marks, and no indication of where the vehicle might have gone. The dry wash split into multiple shallow channels, any of which could have swallowed tracks within a single gust of wind. For their family, the realization came slowly but unmistakably. The girls were no longer simply out cooling off from an argument. Something had happened to them, something fast, unexpected, and concealed by the desert before authorities could understand it. As afternoon stretched on, the investigation widened. Deputies canvassed every rancher, every trucker, every night shift worker who may have been on the road. The trucker, who reported the blinking hazard lights, was recontacted. He confirmed the approximate location, which roughly aligned with the wash. Search teams returned to the area, walking grid patterns, but found nothing resembling a car or hazard lights. Whatever he had seen was gone by daylight. The sister's stepfather was interviewed early. His hands shook as he spoke. He admitted the argument, admitted raising his voice, admitted slamming the kitchen drawer. He said he thought the girls would return after an hour or two. Deputies noted his emotional distress, but nothing about his behavior pointed to direct involvement that morning. Meanwhile, deputies continued searching the immediate area for any more personal effects. By sunset, they found only one additional item, a necklace chain tangled in a creosote bush. It was Riley's, her mother confirmed it instantly. The pendant was missing, but the chain was unmistakably hers. The discovery deepened the sense that whatever occurred wasn't voluntary. Teens running away didn't abandon phones, personal items, or jewelry. Teens running away didn't leave evidence of a struggle. The sun dropped behind the ridgeline, casting long, eerie shadows over the wash. Searchers lingered as long as they could, calling the girls' names into the darkening expanse. The silence that answered was heavy, unnerving, almost deliberate. They marked the area with flags, prepared to resume at dawn, and returned to town with the grim burden of uncertainty. That night, investigators gathered everything they had: the gas station footage, the phone data, the drag marks, the scattered belongings, the trucker's report. None of it formed a coherent story. The sisters had vanished somewhere between the highway and the dunes, vanished in a way that left no clean narrative, no obvious direction, and no trace of where they went next. And in that void, as darkness reclaimed the desert, the first haunting question formed one that would follow the case for 9 long years. How does a car, 2 sisters, and every physical sign of them simply disappear in a matter of hours? It was a question no one could yet answer, and by the next morning, the desert would only grow more silent. The search began before sunrise, long before the desert had a chance to heat up again. Deputies arrived first, followed by volunteers, neighbors, classmates, ranchers who knew the land better than anyone. Within an hour, the sheriff's department had called in additional units from the next county. By mid-morning, it had grown into a full multi-agency operation spanning almost 10 square miles. What everyone feared, but no one said aloud, was that the longer the sisters remained missing, the more the desert worked against them. Teams spread out quickly, mapping quadrants and marking search grids, trying to cover as much ground as possible before the sun rose high enough to erase whatever fragile traces still remained. Drones went up early, scanning for signs of tire ruts or overturned brush. Mounted units traced the edges of washes too deep to access by foot. Scent dogs were brought in, though most handlers knew the truth. In temperatures that would soon surpass 100 degrees, scent trails broke down in minutes. For the first few hours, hope held strong. Searchers believed that the girls might be stranded somewhere nearby, dehydrated, frightened, but alive. With every minute that passed, though, the desert made that hope harder to hold on to. When heat waves began shimmering off the sand just after noon, handlers called for water breaks, and volunteers who had been walking since dawn sat under the rare shade of a mesquite tree, faces flushed, clothes soaked through. Still, they pushed forward. Just after 1 p.m., one of the search teams found something partially buried near the crest of a dune, a plastic water bottle, scuffed and coated in fine dust. The bottle was positioned oddly, almost placed rather than dropped, as if someone had set it down and never picked it up again. Investigators bagged it and marked the site, hoping for a fingerprint or trace evidence. They didn't have to wait long. A print was found on the bottle's neck, but it didn't match Amelia or Riley. It belonged to a male, though later testing failed to place it in any known database. It was the first clue, and immediately one of the most troubling. Either someone else had been with the girls, or someone had been there after them. Not far from the bottle, a searcher spotted something else, dark fabric, half hidden beneath a thin layer of sand. It was a hoodie, faded, torn at the hem, but unmistakably Riley's. Her mother confirmed it on sight. She had worn it almost constantly, even in warm weather, a comfort item she rarely left behind. Its presence deepened the sense of urgency. It suggested movement, struggle, or panic. And it raised a critical question. If the girls had traveled through this area, why had they abandoned something so personal? Deputies marked the location and expanded the search radius around it, hoping the hoodie would anchor the trail. For a moment, optimism returned. If they had one item, they might find others. Maybe the girls had been moving toward shelter, following the wash, or attempting to find higher ground. The logic seemed sound. Then one of the mounted officers radioed in with another discovery, a series of footprints leading toward a remote ravine roughly a mile from the hoodie. The impressions were faint, but still distinguishable. Two smaller sets, likely belonging to the sisters, and a third, larger set, as if someone had been walking alongside or behind them. The terrain grew rockier as the tracks approached the ravine, and then, just 50 feet from its mouth, the prints simply disappeared. The rock absorbed all evidence. There was nothing beyond that point to indicate where the girls or the unknown individual had gone. Investigators struggled to interpret what they were seeing. Each clue pointed to a different scenario. The foreign fingerprint on the bottle suggested an encounter, possibly hostile. The hoodie hinted at distress. The footprints implied movement, potentially forced. Yet none of it formed a complete picture. Every explanation had holes. Some argued abduction, but why would an abductor take the girls deeper into the desert instead of back toward the road? Others leaned toward a runaway theory, fueled by the argument that drove them out of the house. But runaways didn't abandon clothes and veer into dangerous, empty terrain in the dark. A few believed dehydration could explain erratic behavior. Disorientation was common for those lost in desert heat, but the timeline didn't match. The girls had vanished at night, when temperatures were mild, and disorientation wasn't likely until daylight. Every path investigators followed circled back to the same problem. The clues contradicted each other. By the end of the second day, the scent dogs were barely functioning. Their handlers called off several search intervals when the animals showed signs of heat exhaustion. Drone batteries died one after another. Volunteers rotated constantly, red-faced and disoriented. The desert, cold and quiet the night the girls disappeared, had turned violent by day, erasing prints, shifting sand, burying evidence in minutes. Day 3 brought even more complications. A volunteer found a shoe print that didn't match the girls or any searcher, but when investigators returned to examine it, the wind had already reshaped the surface. A rancher riding on the far side of the wash claimed he heard what sounded like a shout, but when teams converged on the area, they found nothing. An abandoned cooler spotted from a drone turned out to belong to a camper who had passed through the region weeks earlier. Each possibility churned up hope before collapsing into disappointment. The days blended into each other after that. Volunteers came and went. Deputies logged 12-hour shifts. Helicopters circled overhead. Each evening, the sheriff addressed the growing crowd of concerned townspeople outside the command post, insisting they would continue searching until all possibilities were exhausted. But the desert remained uncooperative. By the end of the first week, investigators realized that the heat had warped more than the terrain. It had blurred timelines, distorted scent paths, and buried anything the girls might have dropped in their panic. The search zone was now more than 20 miles wide, yet the actual trail had vanished in less than 3. Around this time, tensions within the family began to show. Amelia and Riley's mother tried to remain strong, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. The stepfather withdrew, speaking only when questioned by investigators, often repeating himself or contradicting earlier statements. Relatives began pointing fingers, arguing over what the girls had been thinking that night. The house became an emotional fault line, every conversation cracking under pressure. While the family fractured internally, the outside world began filling in the blanks on its own. The case had reached the internet forums, blogs, and amateur investigators dissected the timeline obsessively. Some insisted the stepfather was involved. Others argued the girls had been targeted by traffickers. A few suggested the sisters staged their disappearance. Rumors spiraled so quickly that investigators struggled to filter credible tips from fabricated ones. A new problem emerged. People from neighboring towns began driving out into the desert looking for hidden evidence, interfering with search efforts and trampling areas investigators hadn't fully processed. Deputies had to turn vehicles away daily, trying to control a growing swarm of curious outsiders. By week 2, search operations changed strategy. Instead of combing blindly, teams focused on potential shelter points, caves, rock outcrops, abandoned sheds, water basins where someone might seek relief from the heat. They found nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a discarded item, not a hint of human presence. It was as if the girls, after leaving those last few clues, had simply ceased to exist. Search coordinators held meeting after meeting, analyzing probabilities, adjusting grid maps, debating whether they were missing something obvious or chasing illusions created by wind and sand. The conflicting evidence weighed heavily on them. Every path led to another dead end. By the third week, the mood among the teams shifted. What had started as a community united in effort began to feel like a battle against an indifferent landscape. Volunteers who once arrived at dawn now showed up late, shoulders slumped. The sheriff's department scaled back air support due to budget strain. Water stations that once held cold jugs now sat half empty, and every day the scorching temperatures returned to strip the desert clean again. Searchers began acknowledging what no one wanted to admit. If the girls were still out there, the desert would not give them back easily. Families dealing with sudden loss often experience a moment when hope and reality collide, and the weight of what may have happened becomes impossible to ignore. For the sisters' family, that moment arrived when investigators recommended transitioning from a rescue operation to a recovery mission. The mother resisted at first, insisting the girls were strong, resourceful, and capable of surviving. Deep down, though, even she knew the odds had shifted. Online communities, sensing the investigation's momentum slowing, grew bolder and more reckless. Anonymous accounts posted theories with absolute certainty. Some accused the family, others accused strangers who had never met the girls. The noise became overwhelming, muddying the water of legitimate investigation. Deputies fielded dozens of false leads each day, sightings, confessions, rumors of buried evidence that evaporated the moment they were checked. In the end, the desert remained the only constant. Wide, silent, vast enough to hold secrets indefinitely. By the time search operations officially scaled back in the third week, there was a quiet resignation hanging over everyone involved. The girls had vanished into terrain known for swallowing entire vehicles, let alone 2 teenagers on foot. And every clue investigators found seemed to contradict the next, forming a puzzle with no center, no edges, no clear picture. What lingered most heavily was the feeling that the truth was still out there just beyond the reach of every grid search, every drone sweep, every theory. Something had happened in those early morning hours, something still waiting to be uncovered, and in the years that followed, the desert's silence would only grow louder. Over the next 9 years, the case refuses to die, even when the rest of the world seems ready to move on. It lingers like a wound that never fully closes, reopening every time the phone rings at odd hours, or a stranger stops the mother in a grocery store to share something they believe might help. Tips arrive in unpredictable waves. Some come handwritten on torn notebook paper, slipped under the door of the sheriff's office by people who won't give their names. Others are delivered by phone calls from distant towns, where someone claims to have seen 2 girls who match the sisters' descriptions. Detectives treat each lead as if it might be the one that finally brings the family answers, even though most crumble quickly under the weight of basic fact-checking. A drifter in Nevada insists he shared a campfire with 2 young runaways who told him they were from Arizona and were trying to get home, but when authorities track him down, they find he changes the girls' ages each time he tells the story. A jailhouse informant confidently claims he helped bury the sisters behind an abandoned motel, only to later admit he fabricated the entire thing, hoping for a reduced sentence. Each collapsed lead chips away at the family's strength, adding to a long list of almost answers that go nowhere. Some tips stand out more than others. A trucker in his late 60s, rattled and exhausted, confesses on his deathbed that he picked up 2 frightened girls the night the sisters vanished. He claims he let them out near a rest stop, believing they'd be safe. For a moment, it feels like a breakthrough. His details are specific, emotional, and consistent. Detectives rush to verify his travel logs, only to discover he had been driving routes hundreds of miles away from the desert that night. Nothing about his story aligns with dispatch records or GPS data. When confronted with the discrepancy, his family reveals he had been slipping in and out of lucidity for weeks, confusing memories from decades earlier. The confession, once promising, becomes just another dead end. 3 years after the disappearance, something eerie jolts the case back into the public eye. It starts with the mother checking her voicemail late one night, expecting nothing more than pharmacy reminders or distant relatives asking how she's holding up. Instead, she hears a shaky recording, faint breathing, static, and what sounds like a girl crying. Over the hum of the background noise, a small voice whispers, "We're here." The message is brief, only a few seconds long, but it's enough to send her into a panic that leaves her trembling. Detectives take the audio seriously and send it for analysis. Specialists examine the frequencies, isolate background sounds, and attempt to match the voice to archived recordings of the girls. Weeks drag on. In the end, the conclusion is maddening, inconclusive. The voice might be one of the sisters, or it might be a cruel prank, or a misdialed number from a frightened child who had nothing to do with the case. Nothing in the recording can be traced. No number, no origin, no certainty. It becomes another haunting echo in a case already filled with too many. As years pass, the case waxes and wanes in the national spotlight. Twice it resurfaces on major news networks after similar disappearances draw comparisons. Each revival brings new interest, new volunteers, and new opinions from people who never knew the girls but are convinced they understand what happened. For a few weeks at a time, hope flares again until the case inevitably stalls, the fresh leads dry up, and the investigation slips back into an uneasy silence. Detectives rotate out, retire, or move on to new assignments. Families relocate, some trying to outrun their grief, others clinging to familiar ground. But the mother refuses to leave. She keeps the girls' room exactly the way it was, blankets folded, posters untouched, a calendar still open to the month before they vanished. She talks about them as if they might walk through the door at any moment, insisting that giving up hope would feel like abandoning them twice. The stepfather copes differently. At first, he helps with the searches, attends vigils, and sits for interviews. But as the years drag on, he grows quieter. He stops answering calls from reporters, avoids public events, and withdraws into a kind of isolation that concerns even those who barely know him. Some take his silence as a sign of guilt. Others see it as the exhaustion of a man who has carried too much pain for too long. Whisper networks start forming in the town, small groups of people sharing theories they believe make sense but have no facts to stand on. The most persistent rumor centers on The Wash, a twisting stretch of dry riverbed known for sudden flash floods that drown anything and anyone caught inside them. Locals claim the wash has taken dozens of lives over the years, sweeping evidence miles downstream and burying it under layers of sediment. The idea becomes its own ghost in the case, a place where people imagine answers lie hidden, even if no one can say for certain. Time changes the investigation in subtle ways. Documents yellow, photographs fade, witnesses forget details they once swore they'd never lose. Detectives who worked the early stages of the case start to retire, leaving behind boxes of evidence that no one has looked at in years. The official stance remains that the case is open, but progress slows to a crawl. Some officers believe the sisters died the night they vanished. Others argue that there is too much that doesn't add up. No bodies, no confirmed sightings, no clear line of events. The lack of resolution becomes a story in itself, and for the family, every year without answers feels like a wound being torn open again. It isn't until the 9th year that something unexpected happens. A new sheriff takes office, a quiet man with a reputation for revisiting cold cases. He isn't interested in headlines or dramatic breakthroughs. He simply believes unfinished investigations deserve a second look. Without announcing it publicly, he begins requesting old files, reading through statements, and studying the original crime scene photography taken on the day the sisters' belongings were found. He spends hours comparing images, looking for inconsistencies or details that might have been overlooked. The photographs were taken in harsh conditions: bright sun, blowing dust, and shifting shadows that distorted scale and color. Still, he notices something odd in one of the older prints. Something small, easily dismissed, yet out of place enough to make him pause. At first, he assumes it's a trick of the lighting or a spot caused by the deterioration of the photo paper. But the more he studies it, the more it bothers him. The object, if it even is an object, appears to be partially buried near the area where Riley's hoodie was discovered. Its shape is faint, uncertain, but not random. The sheriff circles it with a pencil, marking it for follow-up. He compares it to other angles captured that same day, trying to determine whether it was documented by mistake or ignored entirely. The surrounding ground looks disturbed, as if something had been moved or shifted before the photo was taken. None of the reports mention this detail. As he keeps digging, he realizes this discrepancy isn't the only one. Several early photographs show small variations in the arrangement of items, shifts in distance, slight differences in placement, footprints that appear in one frame and vanish in another. Separately, each inconsistency could be dismissed as normal field variation. Together, they form a pattern that raises uncomfortable questions about what investigators originally saw, what they overlooked, and what might still be missing. The sheriff leans back in his chair, looking at the circled mark again, feeling the weight of something he can't yet define. For years, the case has been frozen, held in place by unanswered questions and unverified leads. But now, staring at the faded image, he senses the possibility that something important, perhaps crucial, was left behind in the earliest hours of the investigation. Something that never made it into the reports, never reached the family, and never shaped the public understanding of the case. Something small enough to hide in plain sight for nearly a decade, yet meaningful enough to change the direction of the entire investigation. He sets the photograph aside, careful not to lose the page, and makes a note to revisit the original scene. The desert has changed in 9 years, but traces remain. If he's right, and if the object is still out there, the answers the family has been searching for might not be lost forever. The sheriff closes the file with a slow, deliberate motion, unaware that this discovery, this almost accidental noticing, will alter everything the town believes it knows about the girl's disappearance. The long silence surrounding the case is about to shift, and for the first time in years, the story begins to move again. 9 years after the sisters vanished, the desert finally gives up something it had been holding on to. It happens on an afternoon that feels like any other dry wind scraping across empty land, sun dropping low enough to turn the horizon into a blur of white heat. A rancher is out in the northern stretch of his property, repairing fence posts that never seem to stay upright. He's done this route 100 times, walking the same dusty paths, checking the same weak spots in the wire. But on this day, something small and metallic catches his eye beneath a thin layer of drifting sand. At first, he thinks it's just another piece of scrap, an old hubcap or a chunk of rusted farm equipment half swallowed by the earth. Still, something about the color and curve of it makes him pause. He kneels, brushes away the sand with his hands, and feels his stomach tighten. The object isn't a piece of farm machinery. It's the edge of a car door. He clears more of the sand, realizing the metal isn't just rusted, it's the same shade used on a sedan model from the early 2000s. The same model associated with the sisters' disappearance. The knowledge hits him slowly, settling in with a kind of reluctant certainty. He steps back and calls it in, unable to shake the feeling that he has stumbled into the center of a story he never wanted to be part of. Deputies arrive within the hour. They expect the object to be part of a junked vehicle, maybe left behind decades ago by someone who didn't want to pay disposal fees. But as they start removing layers of hardened earth and wind-packed sand, they realize the door is attached to more metal beneath it. What begins as a simple recovery becomes an excavation. The desert, shaped by 9 years of storms and drifting terrain, had buried nearly an entire vehicle. The deputies work slowly, fighting against collapsing sand that keeps filling the space they dig out. Eventually, the roofline emerges, then the rear window frame, then the contours of the trunk. By the time the full shape of the car is visible, there's no room left for doubt. It's the same make, same model, and same color the missing sisters were last seen driving. The discovery hits the community before the car has even been fully removed from the ground. People gather at the fence line, whispering into phones, leaning on truck doors, remembering where they were the day the girls disappeared. For 9 years, the case had swung between theories: abduction, runaway, accident, and none had settled into anything solid. Now, with the vehicle uncovered, everything shifts into a new, heavier reality. Deputies pry open what remains of the trunk. The hinges groan, corroded after years buried beneath sand. Inside, the contents are barely recognizable at first. Deteriorated strands of fabric that crumble to the touch, the fractured surface of a phone screen yellowed from heat exposure, and a small, delicate necklace tangled in what remains of the lining. The necklace is the only thing that looks untouched by time. The lettering on the charm is faint but visible. Amelia's initials, engraved when she was in middle school. The deputies pause, staring at it, feeling the weight of what it confirms. There had always been hope that the girls were alive somewhere, living under new identities, or being held by someone who refused to let them go. But the necklace changes the tone instantly. It presents a possibility that many had avoided speaking aloud for years. As investigators study the vehicle's condition, they notice something that doesn't align with the idea of an accident. The undercarriage of the car tells a violent story. Scrapes along the metal show it slid across hard rock, not the soft sand of the wash. The angle of the frame suggests the car didn't simply drift into the low ground it had been pushed from a higher elevation with enough force to send it crashing down into the ravine before tumbling into the wash. Once there, desert storms and flash floods likely buried it deeper each year, covering the evidence with layers of sand until it vanished completely from the surface. This realization spreads through the team slowly, building over hours spent examining the damage. No one voices the conclusion immediately. They don't need to. The marks on the metal speak for themselves. The car didn't end up in the wash by chance, and the sisters didn't lose control during a panicked escape. Someone wanted the vehicle hidden. Someone wanted it out of sight, out of reach, and out of the investigation. Detectives who worked the case years earlier arrive at the site, forced back into a nightmare they never truly left behind. Some had always believed the desert had answers locked beneath its harsh surface. Others had assumed the girls had simply walked too far from the vehicle, becoming victims of heat and disorientation. But the damage beneath the car erases the more innocent theories. Word spreads among the officials quietly. This isn't a missing person case anymore. It's something darker. The sister's mother arrives at the sheriff's office before the news becomes public. She has lived with the ache of uncertainty for nearly a decade, waking each day bracing for another false lead or another tip that collapses under scrutiny. When she's told the car has been found, she reacts with a kind of stunned silence, the kind that builds before grief breaks open. She asks if the girls were inside. The sheriff shakes his head. She asks if anything belonged to them. The sheriff tells her about the necklace, the phone fragments, the fibers that might have been clothing. She closes her eyes, and in that moment, the last thin strand of hope she'd been holding on to begins to unravel. The stepfather sits alone in his truck after hearing the news, gripping the steering wheel until his hands shake. For years, he had lived trapped between guilt and helplessness, blamed by some, defended by others, never fully sure how to carry the burden of the unknown. The discovery of the car forces him to confront the possibility that the girls didn't simply walk away. Something happened to them. Something done by someone who wanted them gone. Locals gather in small clusters to talk, piecing together new theories that feel heavier and sharper than the ones they passed around in earlier years. Conversations circle back to the wash, the same place rumored to swallow anything that fell into it. Now those whispers feel prophetic. The wash didn't hide the truth by accident. Someone used it. Someone trusted the desert to do the rest. Detectives sift through the interior of the buried car, photographing every inch, collecting samples, noting positions of debris. Even in its ruined state, the vehicle offers fragments of a story that had been locked away for nearly a decade. But it also raises new questions about how it got there, about what happened before it entered the wash, and about who knew the terrain well enough to use it to erase evidence. What the officers don't say out loud is that whoever pushed the car likely believed it would never be found, and for 9 years, they were right. As the car is lifted from the ground and loaded for transport, investigators look toward the surrounding hills with a different kind of awareness. The discovery changes the trajectory of the entire case. What once looked like a tragic disappearance now points toward intent, toward deliberate action, toward someone who didn't just want the sisters gone, but wanted their story buried under years of desert wind. The shift settles like a quiet storm among the investigators. They know what comes next. They know this is no longer a search for 2 missing girls. This is the beginning of a homicide investigation, and the person responsible has had almost a decade to stay hidden. Fresh forensic teams move in with a sense of urgency sharpened by the discovery of the buried vehicle. For years, the case drifted between dusty file boxes and periodic revivals, never gaining enough traction to break free from speculation. But the moment the car is pulled from the wash, everything accelerates. Specialists handle each fragment as if it carries the weight of the girls' voices, thin fibers removed with tweezers, rusted metal photographed from every angle, dirt sifted grain by grain. What they uncover next is unexpected and deeply unsettling. Just a few yards from where the vehicle had been buried, investigators find small, irregular fragments of bone mixed into the sediment along the wash's edge. At first, no one is certain whether the fragments belong to an animal or a human, but testing reveals the truth quickly. They belong to one person, and the markings on them are not random erosion. There are signs of defensive wounds, sharp, angled impressions consistent with someone shielding themselves against blunt trauma. The discovery hits the investigative team hard. For years, they'd worked with a gap. They never knew whether the girls had walked away from the car or been forced into something far worse. These bone fragments shift the narrative. Whoever fought back. Even more alarming is what the lab uncovers next. On the decayed fabric pulled from the vehicle and on the cracked phone casing found in the trunk, there are tiny cellular traces material too degraded to produce a full profile, but intact enough to confirm the presence of a third individual. The DNA does not belong to either sister. It's male, and it's unknown. The finding forces investigators to re-examine everything they had assumed in the early days of the case. Back in 2016, when deputies first responded to the scattered belongings near the dry wash, they noted odd tire marks stretching across the soft sand, but with no clear direction and no matching vehicle found at the time, the marks were dismissed as unrelated. Now, with the pressure of new evidence, detectives pull the old photographs and reanalyze the impressions using updated methods. They digitally reconstruct tread patterns and compare them to vehicle records archived from the sisters' small desert town. One match stands out almost immediately. The tracks line up with an older truck model once owned by a man who worked alongside the girl's stepfather at a local construction yard. The discovery is jolting not because the man was ever a suspect, but because he disappeared himself a few months after the sisters went missing. The resurfacing of his name sends investigators back into the archives, pulling records, employment files, and statements from anyone who knew him. Former coworkers describe him as quiet, volatile when drinking, and overly friendly with younger people, comments that were brushed aside as gossip nearly a decade ago. But one detail catches everyone's attention. The man left town suddenly, abandoning his trailer, job, and personal belongings. At the time, it was chalked up to unpaid debts and a failing marriage. Now, within the context of the buried car and the unknown DNA, the explanation feels thinner and more convenient than ever before. Detectives replay interview tapes recorded during the initial search. They've listened to these tapes countless times over the years, but with fresh information, familiar answers begin to sound different. The stepfather's voice, calm and composed in earlier months, takes on a subtle tension. Small details, timing, phrasing, the casual dismissal of certain questions are no longer dismissed. The team begins building a timeline of his movements on the night the girls vanished, and the gaps become more apparent. There are 30 minutes he can't account for between leaving the house and arriving at a friend's place. His explanation for the missing time had always been that he needed to cool off. But now investigators learned something he never shared. He had access to a second set of keys to the family sedan, keys he claimed to have misplaced, only to later admit he forgot to mention them during the early interviews. The inconsistencies are subtle enough that they didn't register as red flags 9 years earlier. But with the discovery of the car's undercarriage damage, the bone fragments showing defensive wounds, and the trace DNA belonging to an unknown man tied to someone within the stepfather's social circle, the gaps widen into something impossible to ignore. As detectives sort through these clues, a new theory forms, one that feels unnervingly plausible. It begins with the argument that pushed Amelia and Riley to leave the house that night. Investigators believe the girls drove away in anger, wanting distance from the tension that had been brewing at home. Somewhere along the isolated stretch of Highway 72, they likely pulled over. Maybe they needed to cool down. Maybe they needed to think. Or maybe they saw someone they recognized, a man familiar enough to make them stop. Someone connected to their family, or someone whose face they knew through the stepfather, someone who would not have triggered immediate fear. In the dark silence of that road, trust may have turned into panic. A confrontation might have erupted, something small that escalated quickly. The signs of struggle at the wash, the scattered belongings, the tire marks, and the buried vehicle suggest the situation spiraled into violence. Amelia, the older sister, could have tried to intervene or protect Riley. One or both might have attempted to run. Defensive wounds on the bone fragments point to a desperate moment where survival hinged on seconds. The new theory unsettles everyone involved in the investigation. It doesn't answer every question, but it pieces together a chain of events that had been fractured for years. A familiar figure approaches. A confrontation becomes violent. Someone panics and tries to hide what happened. The vehicle is pushed from a height, rolled into the wash, and left for storms and shifting terrain to swallow. And the man who once owned the truck matching the tire impressions disappears quietly from the town months later, leaving behind a trail that abruptly ends. Investigators feel the case tightening around them. Threads that once drifted loosely between unrelated incidents now tether to a central point. Whoever confronted the sisters had a connection to the household, a connection to the stepfather's workplace, and a reason to hide the truth so deeply that 9 years of desert storms could not erase it entirely. This understanding doesn't bring closure. It brings urgency. It forces detectives to step back and ask themselves a question that had only been whispered in the earliest days of the investigation. If the girls were pulled over by someone they knew, someone who approached them in the dark, who else might have known? And how much was buried along with that car, waiting for the right moment to surface? What ultimately happened on that desert road begins to take shape only when investigators force themselves to reconstruct every step of the girls' final night, not as scattered clues or isolated fragments of evidence, but as a continuous sequence of choices, movements, fears, and reactions that collided in the darkness of an unforgiving landscape. It starts inside the small house where the sisters lived, a place that had always been filled with the usual tension of a blended family, but never anything dangerous enough to trigger real alarm. On that night, the argument that pushed Amelia and Riley out the door wasn't violent or explosive. It was the kind of heated exchange that happens when tempers, exhaustion, and stressed relationships collide. Their stepfather had been drinking again, not heavily but just enough for his words to become sharper. Amelia, already protective of Riley, pushed back harder than usual. The disagreement grew louder, and the girls finally stormed out, grabbing keys and insisting they needed to just get away for a bit. The stepfather didn't chase after them. He only yelled something into the hallway, something dismissive that he regretted almost immediately. This detail, the tone of that final argument, matters more than anyone realized at the time, because someone else heard it, someone who had no business standing close enough to notice the raised voices or the sound of the front door slamming. The co-worker who lived only a few houses down, and who often spent time around the family under the guise of helping with repairs, had walked past the home at the exact moment the argument peaked. People who knew him would later describe him as observant, in a way that felt intrusive, someone who always listened more than he spoke. He heard enough to understand the girls were leaving, and for reasons investigators would never fully understand, anger, opportunity, obsession, or something darker, he decided to follow them. It wasn't improvised. He had access to the stepfather's old truck, a beat-up vehicle that had been lent to him frequently in the months before the disappearance, whenever his own transportation failed. That night, he took it again, without asking, without leaving a message. He got behind the wheel and drove only a few minutes behind the sisters as they headed down Highway 72, a stretch of road they knew well enough to drive half awake. It cut through open desert so flat and empty it was easy to believe no danger could exist there. But the co-worker understood the landscape better than they did. He knew where cell service vanished, where the shoulder dipped into loose sand, and where headlights could disappear from sight within seconds if someone swerved off the asphalt. Detectives now believe the sisters pulled over by choice. Their last gas station footage shows anxiety in their expressions, but not fear. They weren't running from someone, they were trying to settle themselves. Highway 72 was their quiet place, a road where they could talk without the weight of the house pressing down on them. They likely intended to sit in the parked car, breathe, maybe cry, maybe laugh at how dramatic everything had gotten. But a truck approaching in the darkness would have changed the tone instantly. They might have recognized the silhouette of it. They might have known who was behind the wheel. They might have assumed he was checking on them, or sent by their stepfather, or simply passing by. What happened next is pieced together from tire impressions, dragged sand patterns, and the forensic reconstruction of the car's damage. The truck did not simply park behind them. It cut ahead, swerved sharply, and forced the girls off the road. Investigators believe Amelia panicked. She was old enough to sense when something felt wrong. The drag marks show she attempted to reverse, but the sand beneath the tires prevented traction. The co-worker approached the driver's side door, and the struggle began there. One of the sisters, almost certainly Amelia, tried to fight him off. That fight left the defensive wounds discovered years later, markings on bone that told a story too brutal to ignore. For Riley, younger and less physically strong, there was likely a moment of paralyzing fear. She may have tried to run. Footprints found in 2016, the ones that vanished into rock before investigators lost the trail, suddenly made sense. One set matched her size. She had sprinted toward the ravine, desperate and disoriented, believing the darkness might hide her. But the co-worker caught up. The area was too open, too silent, and too unforgiving for escape. Lead detectives now believe both sisters died near the ravine, only minutes apart. Their remains were likely scattered by wildlife over time, leaving behind only fragments small enough to blend into the desert earth. There were signs of blunt force trauma, and no suggestion of a prolonged chase or an attempt to move them far from the initial struggle. The co-worker panicked. He realized the girl's abandoned vehicle would be found, and if the vehicle was found, everything would point straight back to him. So he did the one thing he believed could erase the evidence. He used the truck to push their sedan toward the ravine, sending it rolling down the slope. The car struck rock, then tumbled into the wash below. He expected the next storm or the next flood to bury it completely. In this part of the desert, washes are known for hiding everything from vehicles to cattle bones within days. And he was right. By the time deputies arrived in the early hours after the disappearance, the terrain had already shifted enough to mislead them. Within a few months, the car was invisible. The co-worker left town shortly afterward. To the people he worked with, his departure looked abrupt but not suspicious. He'd always been unstable, always halfway packed for a future that never seemed to materialize. When he disappeared completely months later, leaving behind unpaid rent, tools scattered across his yard, and clothing still hanging in his closet, his disappearance seemed almost predictable. The truth of where he went next only came to light years later through employment records, medical reports, and the reconstruction of his final months. He took a series of jobs in different counties, drifting from one project to another. Eventually, he landed on a construction crew working near a mining site. It was there, less than 2 months after the sisters went missing, that he died in what was officially documented as a workplace accident. A scaffolding collapse pinned him under several hundred pounds of steel and concrete. The incident killed him instantly. He never answered for what happened. He never explained why he followed the sisters. He never gave investigators the confession they needed to close the case before it consumed nearly a decade of air and energy. When detectives confirmed the timeline, the emotional impact ripples through everyone connected to the case. The rancher who uncovered the buried car hears the update from deputies and sits down on the back of his truck, shaken by how narrowly the truth had been saved. One more season of storms, one more year of drifting sand, and the vehicle might have disappeared entirely. The sheriff's office releases a statement privately to the family first, unwilling to let them hear the details through rumor or news alerts. The mother listens quietly, holding her hands together the same way she did 9 years earlier when she filed the missing persons report. The necklace recovered from the trunk is handed to her in a small evidence envelope, the metal cleaned but still scarred from years underground. She touches the engraving Amelia's initials, tracing it with the kind of tenderness that suggests she is trying to memorize the texture before grief shatters her focus. The stepfather breaks down in a way no one expected. For years, he had carried guilt for the argument that drove the girls out of the house, guilt that people whispered about behind his back, guilt that he tried to swallow by insisting the girls would be found alive. But the new information forces him to confront something far heavier. He had noticed warning signs in the coworker long before the girls vanished. Jokes that felt off, stares that lingered too long, a tendency to show up at the house uninvited. He had brushed them aside, telling himself he was being paranoid or judgmental. Now he has to live with the knowledge that ignoring those instincts may have cost the sisters their lives. He does not deny it. He does not defend himself. He sits with the guilt because he believes he deserves to feel it. For the detectives, closure comes in complicated layers. They know they solved the case. They know the evidence aligns cleanly with the reconstructed timeline. But they also know the person responsible is beyond prosecution, beyond interrogation, beyond accountability. There will be no interview where subtle lies reveal themselves, no confession where details flow out in a mix of remorse and cowardice. No day in court where the community finally learns every truth ripped from the shadows. The case ends not with justice, but with understanding, a thin consolation for a crime that stole 2 young lives before they had a chance to say goodbye to anyone. And yet, the resolution provides something essential. It restores the girls' story from rumor to truth. For years, their names had been pulled into speculation, conspiracy theories, and online debates about whether they ran away, were trafficked, or staged their disappearance. The discovery of the car, the reconstruction of the event, and the identification of the coworker's role wipes away the noise. The truth is quieter and far more devastating. 2 sisters tried to escape tension at home. A predator with a personal connection exploited the moment. And the desert, vast and indifferent, held the secret for nearly a decade. In the final moments of the investigation's summary, one detective makes a quiet observation that lingers with everyone in the room. If the rancher hadn't stopped to fix that fence post, if the light hadn't struck the metal at the perfect angle, if the wind hadn't shifted in those exact weeks, the truth might have stayed buried forever. The desert is full of stories like this: lost objects, lost people, lost answers, but this time, the winds moved just enough to reveal what had been hidden. The case closes with the mother standing alone beside the wash where the car was found. She holds the necklace in her hand, gripping it tightly enough to leave marks on her palm. For her, closure doesn't erase pain. It doesn't bring her daughters home, but it allows her to breathe in a way she hadn't allowed herself to breathe in 9 years. It gives her a place to mourn with certainty, a place to speak their names without fear of imagining the wrong fate. And it reminds her that even if too much time passed, even if justice never arrived, the truth surfaced. The winds shifted. The desert finally spoke. And for a mother who waited nearly a decade for answers, that truth is the only thing left to hold on to.